What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Cosmic Wonder. Today we're breaking down Daredevil Born Again episode 4. This episode was a little bit different than the other episodes that we've gotten so far, so I'd love to hear what you thought about this episode in the comments down below. Let me know where you'd rank it out of the 4 episodes that we've gotten so far. So the recap, of course, shows us that in the last episode, Matt was defending Hector Ayala, aka the White Tiger. He won the case for him, but he did warn him that he can't go out as the White Tiger anymore. Hector explaining last episode that it's who he is, it's not something that he could just control, went out again as the White Tiger and unfortunately and very sadly was killed. So we pick up in this episode at the coroner's. We see a bunch of Hector's things laid out and eventually they show us the White Tiger mask and the amulet. And this whole scene, I believe, is building up to the new White Tiger coming in the MCU, possibly later on in Daredevil Born Again season 1 or maybe in season 2, or perhaps Marvel has a plan for the new White Tiger down the road. But the coroner packs up the bag filled with the White Tiger's things, including the amulet. That's the biggest part because that's what gives the wielder of it the power of the White Tiger. So Matt's talking to the coroner and they've clearly met before because he says, "Sorry about your client, Murdoch." And in this scene, they basically explained that it was a shot that had no room for error, but they never found the shell to the bullet. It was a point blank shot, so it should have been laying on the floor somewhere, but nobody found it. And the coroner, of course, says, "Look, if it's not on the body, that's not my problem, man." Then Matt, with his super senses, his super hearing, hears some footsteps coming down the hall, and he also hears a young woman pant. And this is Hector's niece, Angela, who I believe is going to be the next White Tiger. And it even sounds like she kind of snuck her way into this section because the coroner says, "How did you get in here? You're not supposed to be in here." So clearly there's some security measures that she snuck past. She comes in and she says, "I want to see what they did to my uncle," but since he was shot through the head, clean shot, Matt says, "No, you don't. You want to remember him as he was, not with a bullet through his head." So he says, "Come on, let's go." And they specifically showed the two of them locking arms. Obviously, she knows that Matt is blind, but I also think they're trying to show us here an up-close shot of Hector's belongings that Matt is holding in his hand. And although they don't show it at the end of the scene, I do believe that he gives her her uncle's things when she leaves. Therefore, he gives her the amulet, which can give her the powers of the White Tiger. And in this conversation, we learn that she is very smart. She knows it was the dirty cops who did this. Matt says, "We don't know that." And I almost feel like right here he's trying to convince himself, because if he believes that it's the dirty cops, then he has to come back as Daredevil, which he's really trying not to do. But Angela basically calls him out saying, "Come on, you already know it's the dirty cops. You're smart." And yeah, everybody would know. But here we have more foreshadowing about Daredevil's return. Angela says, "I hate this city. Nobody's going to do anything about it. Nobody ever will. The cops are dirty and no one can do anything about it because they are the cops." But here again, Matt is trying to convince himself. He says, "You have to believe that somebody will find his killer. We have to believe that somebody will find his killer." Again, trying to convince himself that Daredevil does not need to come back. Now, he's going to do his part as Matt Murdock to try and find his killer, which we see kind of happen in this episode. But again, he's really trying to hold in the devil. Now, cutting to some murals that Muse has done because he puts his name there at the bottom of them. We see one of Kingpin and one of the Punisher. This is actually the most that we've seen of Muse in any of the episodes. We're actually seeing him here. They even again go on to tease him at the end of this in sort of a post-credit type of deal, showing us that he really is the big villain of this. It's only a brief tease because he's not the full-on villain yet. They show that he has captured somebody and he's taking them back to his secret lair that he's got underground in the subway. They're basically just saying, "Hey, beware, there is somebody else out there that you need to worry about besides Kingpin and Bullseye and the dirty cops who are running around with the Punisher's logo. Keep him in the back of your mind." We then cut to a club where we see Daniel, who is becoming very close with Kingpin, and Bibi Urich, who we know is the niece of Ben Urich from the original Daredevil Netflix series, who Kingpin himself killed. He strangled him with his own hands. And we know that Daniel is into Bibi because in episode 2, they do explain that Daniel is basically into Bibi and he should have known that Bibi giving him her number had an agenda, and that was to try and get closer to Kingpin, to try to get in with him. And you can pretty much assume that the same thing is going on here. Daniel is still into Bibi, but I'm assuming Bibi is trying to get close with Daniel so she can get some information out of him about Kingpin, which does happen happen in the scene as Daniel gets drunk. And in this scene, you can tell two very important things. One is that Daniel really does love Kingpin and what he is trying to do. He believes in Mayor Wilson Fisk. Even when he's talking about his hard schedule, he even says, what can I say? I love the guy. And being a little drunk, his guard is down. So he starts to talk about how excited he is about some things that Kingpin is doing, like a new recycling deal. And you can see here that BB takes advantage of this opportunity and says, hey, that could be cool, trying to get Daniel to talk more about it, in which he does. And then she takes this information that he gave her and she spins it into a bad story against Kingpin, but we'll get to that in a second. Outside of the club, as Daniel leaves, we see across the street cops arresting Leroy Bradford. This ends up becoming Matt's client because Heather asked Matt to take on this case because essentially they owed somebody. Now, when Heather calls Matt to ask him to take the case, he is actually contemplating Daredevil things. He's on the rooftop of his building, in which later on we do find out that that's where he keeps all of his Daredevil related things. He's playing with the horn to one of his Daredevil cowls that Karen gave him. He lost it in episode 1 in his fight against Bullseye, but Karen found it and gave it to him again in episode 1. Now, this is a recurring theme throughout this entire episode. Matt debating if he should return as Daredevil. Normally, he wants to rely on the system to work so he doesn't have to return as Daredevil, but in this episode, he discovers that the system really doesn't work. He did it the right way with Hector Ayala, but he was still killed anyways due to the corruption. Then he learns more about the system from Leroy Bradford. And instead of jumping from scene to scene, we're just going to tackle all of the scenes with Leroy right now. So Matt goes to the jail and he meets Leroy, and Leroy starts kind of making jokes about him being blind, a blind lawyer. Matt explains that he's being charged for stealing boxes of Fiddle Faddle caramel corn. Leroy says he didn't do it, but Matt explains, hey, they had a really good security system. Everything's on footage. Plus the clerk is willing to testify that you did indeed steal them. An interesting part of this is Leroy obviously realizes, okay, crap, I can't say that I didn't steal them because they clearly know that I did. Can I say that it's a scroll? Notice that in this part right here, he's actually asking Matt if this is a viable option to get him off the hook. He literally says, could it have been a scroll? And Matt actually pauses for a brief second, possibly debating in his mind, could we actually say this was a scroll? Nope. And the reason for that being is because he has a pretty big criminal record from his past. So they're not going to buy that it was a scroll when he's done this many times before. But the biggest thing here is they are actually acknowledging that the human population knows that the scroll do exist. I know many people want to act like Secret Invasion didn't exist, but it happened, and now the world knows that there are scroll out there, aliens who could shapeshift. And some people try to possibly use that as an advantage to themselves in certain situations, like this one right here. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out for him. So Leroy says no matter what, he can't go to prison. Matt doesn't exactly understand, but he goes to the DA and tries to get the best possible deal he can, and he actually does get that. But he comes back and Leroy is still very adamant about not going to prison because the last time he was locked up for 30 days, he missed his appointment with SSI, Supplemental Security Income. Basically, he gets benefits from the government because he doesn't really have any income. He's on food stamps, but he had to miss his appointment with them last time he was in prison, and the food stamps got taken away, so he has no money and he has no food. It's gotten so bad to the point that he's had to eat food out of the dumpster and he's had to beg for change on the side of the street. And this scene is basically showing Matt yet again the system doesn't always work. Leroy even says, the system is screwing me. I try to do better, but things happen, and the system exponentially multiplies a crappy situation into a really bad one. And the biggest point of this is Matt actually does understand this, and this is yet another thing leading to him becoming Daredevil once again. Because it always was Matt trying to do justice by the legal system, and when it fails, Daredevil comes into play to finish the job. But that hasn't happened in a long time. But as Matt discovers more and more that the system doesn't work, he's gonna have to return as Daredevil. Meanwhile, we find out a lot about Kingpin and Vanessa. They're in therapy with Matt's girlfriend, Heather Glenn, Dr. Glenn, and they finally talk about the affair that Vanessa had. Now, Vanessa keeps saying, Kingpin was gone. He left. I didn't know when he was going to come back. He could have been gone forever. So yeah, I had an affair. I moved on because when he left, he really hurt me. And we find out that it brought up a lot about her past that traumatized her with her parents. Kingpin said, well, he didn't know that. She never told him. And she knew that he would never really leave. He just needed some time away, but she knew he'd come back. Now, they do talk about Adam, who Vanessa had an affair with, but you can tell Kingpin really doesn't want to. In fact, he straight up says it, and he says that the whole thing is pretty ridiculous. You can tell that Kingpin doesn't really believe that he's in this situation. He never thought that it would happen. Dr. Glenn asks Vanessa if the affair is over, if she has ended it, but she said she never got a chance. And Kingpin revealed that he met with Adam, but he says he didn't really do anything to him. Even though Vanessa definitely implies that Kingpin probably took Adam out of the situation, but Kingpin says, no, it wasn't like that, not this time. We just had a dialogue. Vanessa says, do you want to be more specific? And Kingpin says, no. When he says no, look at Dr. Glenn, you can tell that she is wondering if something's up with Kingpin, because obviously Vanessa is implying that Kingpin did some dirty things to take him out. Because everybody in New York City pretty much knows that Kingpin used to be a crime boss. And Vanessa even says, I know you, your methods are more direct. Which ultimately leads to Dr. Glenn speaking to Vanessa alone after, basically asking, hey, are you safe? Has Kingpin touched you? Because it kind of seems like he's a violent man with a violent past. Plus, not to mention, his knuckles are kind of bloody every time I see him. And Vanessa says, no, I've never been worried about that. And when the meeting ends, Dr. Glenn asks them if they're trying to dissolve a marriage or save it. And that's something that they both have to go on to think about. Now, while Matt Murdock is struggling to keep the devil inside and not become Daredevil again, Wilson Fisk is also struggling with being mayor of New York City and being, well, let's just say clean and not the crime boss Kingpin. He wants to make one of the worst parts of the city, Red Hook, a better place, and he simply wants to just start doing it and announce it right away. However, Wilson's political advisor Sheila informs him that, hey, I know you're mayor and I know you're used to doing things a different way when you were a crime boss, but in government there's a lot of different steps that you have to go through. So Kingpin says, all right, tell me the steps, and she starts listing a lot of them, and he says, okay, basically start at the beginning, let's get this going. And you can tell that he's getting very frustrated that he can't just simply do things and make them better. He's got to go through a lot of red tape, which he says isn't really his thing. He's used to saying, this is what I want, let's do it now, boom, done. Now, Red Hook is a place that Kingpin wants to clean up, but it's also a place where all of the dirty work gets done by the other crime families. And before they leave, Buck does tell him personally, there is a problem going on here, and one of the other families is either going to rise up and ascend, as in become the new boss, or they're all going to kill each other, you probably included in that. And this is just yet another pull at Wilson Fisk to get him to come back as Kingpin. And to top it all off, Wilson is starting to deal with things that he really doesn't like as mayor, like going to schools and listening to children sing. He dislikes this so much that he's barely managing to smile, and when the teacher says, all right, we're about to sing another one for you, he says, no, just straight up says, nope, don't do that, I'm leaving, but thanks. Peace. He hates it. And then on top of it all, B.B. Urich, taking what Daniel said when he was drunk, does an article that states Mayor Garbage, a union buster. So now Kingpin has to deal with what he calls leaks from his cabinet. And he just starts yelling at his whole team. And he says, I will find out who did this. But to Daniel's credit, he does have courage, he takes responsibility, and he comes out and he said, it was me. Then we start to slowly see how Kingpin is returning and Mayor Fisk is kind of going away. And Daniel even kind of addresses not the mayor, but Kingpin. He says, you're right to fire me or punish me or do whatever you're gonna do to me. Because he knows who Kingpin is and what he used to be and still kind of is. But one thing he does is that he shows that he is courageous and that he is loyal to Kingpin, two things that Kingpin really values. And Kingpin's face is actually pleasantly surprised. He even smiles and he says, I've learned that loyalty and courage are two qualities that aren't easily replicated. And this is where I think Kingpin starts to think about Daniel as somebody who is more than just a person working for the mayor, but is somebody who can personally work for him, even to execute some dirty work like Buck is currently doing for him. Because yet again, the Kingpin side of William Fisk comes out, where he puts his arm on his shoulder and says, if you do anything like that again, it'll be the last thing you ever do. Not the last thing you do for me, not the last thing you do before I fire you. But he means literally the last thing he's going to do, because if he screws up again like that, he's going to end up 6 feet underground, dead. And actually, I'm kind of starting to think that Daniel might end up killing BB. Like, there might be a situation in the future where he finds out that she's gonna do something about Kingpin, write a bad report, or he accidentally slips up again, can't let it get out, so he kills her. Which would be kind of crazy mirroring, because Kingpin killed her uncle, and then Kingpin's guy goes on to kill her, his niece. Or maybe he even gives her up to Kingpin and says she's gotta go, and Kingpin ends up killing her. Now, cutting back to before, where Matt was at the courthouse trying to deal with the sentence for Leroy, he runs into Officer Powell again, the cop who lied about what happened to Hector, who he assumes had something to do with killing him. And Matt basically calls him out on this. He says, you couldn't have a weak link out there, huh? Or maybe it was pride. And he straight up says, is that why you did it? This doesn't sit well with Powell, and he throws his badge on him. And it's very weird because he's very hypocritical here, but he does say that his grandfather wore the badge, his father wore it, his brother wore it, his cousins wore it. They're all cops and they do it with pride. And that's ironic because he literally told the other guy that he was with that one time to kill Matt. So he's talking about pride and honor, but I mean, he is a dirty cop still. However, when he tells Matt he doesn't know anything about what happened with Hector, the death of the White Tiger, Matt is listening to his heartbeat and it is not increasing. So he knows that he is actually telling the truth. At least that's how it typically works with Matt in hearing people's heartbeats. When they increase or the heartbeat changes drastically, that's when he knows that they are lying. However, in the comics, he can be kind of fooled. Like if somebody has a pacemaker or if somebody simply can control their heart rate very well. So that could be what's happening here, but you can tell by the look on Matt's face that he is a little confused to hear that his heart rate isn't really changing much. Maybe he is telling the truth. But then right away, he goes on and he threatens Matt, basically says he's gonna go tell the bar that might get him disbarred and maybe he can't practice law anymore, which does happen in the comics. In fact, Hochberg is actually one of the people who vows for Matt to become a lawyer once again, so maybe they will go that route. Maybe he does rat him out and Matt doesn't win. But then he also says maybe he goes and gets some of his buddies and they go rough up Matt, basically is what he's saying. And Matt says, yeah, well, you'd have to bring more than the last time because basically I beat your face in and the other guy as well. So he's not a good cop, which makes what he said very hypocritical. Maybe all of his family's crooked, but for now it doesn't seem like Matt thinks he was involved with the death of Hector the White Tiger. So he starts to go investigate the scene of where Hector was shot himself because the shell of the bullet was never found by the cops. And he's able to discover that the bullet actually rolled down the hill into a sewer drain because of a bottle that's near him. He kicks it and it falls down the hill, goes into the sewer drain, and that tells him what might have happened to it. In this case, it did happen to it. And he feels on it the logo, which is the Punisher logo. So Matt, knowing where Frank Castle is, the Punisher, goes to see him. And Frank Castle returns. And if you did not hear the news, Marvel Studios has literally confirmed that there is going to be a Punisher special presentation coming to Disney+. This was revealed in the Daredevil Born Again interviews by the head of Marvel Television, Brad Winderbaum. So the Punisher, Frank Castle, is back for a while. And here we actually get a really raw and emotional scene. And honestly, a really killer scene as well. Matt goes to Frank's base and is greeted by him in a very aggressive way, but once he realizes it's Matt, he puts the axe down and gives him a very loving greeting. He says, "What do you want?" Matt explains that a cop was killed. On the shell was his logo, the Punisher logo. Here we find out that there are Punisher fanboys, so basically people imitating what he's doing. Matt explains that, yeah, cops are doing it as well. But Frank doesn't really see that as his problem. He does what he does, and it's not his fault if some dirty cops want to use his logo. Although we know that he hates this and is going to do something about it. Now from here we kind of get classic Daredevil versus Punisher. When the Punisher first appeared on the Netflix Daredevil series in season 2, and how it is in the comics as well, is the Punisher actually takes it upon himself to be the executioner. He kills people, whereas Daredevil does not, for multiple different reasons. He's Catholic, plus he believes that the system should be the one to punish them. But again, this episode is entirely about how the system fails, and even the Punisher in this scene is showing Matt how he needs to be Daredevil again. Matt tries to tell Frank, you know, you could use your skills to help people, to contribute. And Frank even says, I tried to do that. I was on the other end. Look where it got me. And he's talking about him being in the military and then coming home and his family being killed. And in Daredevil season 2, he even learned that his commanding officer at the time, who he knew and trusted, was against him as well, and he ended up killing him. So the system did not work for Frank Castle. So he's obviously not coming back. And Matt says, are you plotting your next kill? Frank says, you're damn right I am. I take things into my own hands. Unlike you, who he basically says, you're a little superhero kid who's not willing to do it. You're kind of a pansy. But Frank hits the nail on the head when he says, you know what? I think you're afraid because you want to get your hands on somebody, but you're afraid that means you got to return as Daredevil. But he says, I think you want to. I think that's why you came to me, to basically get permission to do so, because you know I'll cross that line. Then he pulls out the perfect Matt Murdock heartstrings. He starts talking about Foggy and how basically this is all about Foggy. Matt hates himself because he hasn't done anything about Foggy's death. He did get Bullseye put in prison, but that's not what he wanted. He wants Foggy to live and Bullseye to not be alive. But the opposite is true. Foggy died and Bullseye's still alive. But Matt wishes that he could do something about that. He wishes Bullseye could be punished even more. Then Frank drops just this epic line where he says, you hear him, don't you? I hear my boy. And you know what he tells me? He says, go get them, every last one of them. And that's why I do what I do. And you haven't done a thing. Daredevil went away, you pushed him aside, and it eats you up. Then once again, Matt brings up the system. I gave him to the system. And Frank yet again calls him out, says the system doesn't work. Foggy's dead, Bullseye's alive in prison. And Matt knows that this is true. And this is why it leads to the ending of this, where Matt basically returns as Daredevil. More on that in just a bit. Now, the final scenes of this episode are very important. One is when Matt goes home, Heather is there waiting for him. And two things you need to know here. One is that Matt, once again, is referring to the system when he says, you ever feel like you're pushing a rock up a hill and people are pushing back down on it? This is basically him saying, I've been trying to do it the right way through the system and it's just not working. And the other thing is Vanessa does actually mention Wilson and Vanessa, but she doesn't mention them by name, obviously, because she can't legally, as a psychiatrist, talk about her patients or reveal who they are. And she even signed an NDA because it's the mayor, but she does mention them to Matt. So I am assuming at some point in time in this series, Matt is going to find out that she is the therapist to Kingpin and Vanessa. Now, at the same time, Kingpin and Vanessa are having dinner. This shot is meant to show us that they are indeed getting closer together. Before, they were sitting on complete opposite sides, long ways of the table. Now they're sitting much closer together, facing each other without anything in between them like flowers or something. And Kingpin says, look, forgiveness isn't something I really learned growing up. My dad didn't really teach me that, but I am trying, and I would like things to go back to normal. Vanessa says, well, I'm not the same woman I was before. And that's because she is stronger and she's in a better position now. And Kingpin acknowledges this. And Kingpin specifically says he wants things to go back to the way they were before. And I do believe he is referring to when he was the Kingpin, not the mayor. He's finding out that being mayor isn't exactly what he thought it was going to be. He thought he would be able to do change to the city really quickly, but that's not how it is. So our two final scenes here are of Kingpin going underground in a little secret lair, true villain style, revealing to us, one, that he actually does have the original painting that he got from Vanessa, the white one that reminded him of his room when he was a child, the white wall that still has the blood on it from where in the final episode of the final season in Daredevil on the Netflix show, Daredevil beat his face in and his blood splattered all over the painting. It's still there. And that's very symbolic. It's meant to show that this is Kingpin. And as we go deeper, we find out, yeah, it's still Kingpin. He has Adam, the person that Vanessa had an affair with, locked up. And he's even taunting him by eating a really nice dinner in front of him, showing us that this is Kingpin. Yes, he's tried to go good. He's tried to be the mayor in a legit way, but he is still Kingpin and he is still doing very dirty things. Then at the same time, mirroring this, Matt decides to go up on the roof where all of his Daredevil things are, and he becomes Daredevil once again. We see all of the different cowls that he has, and I'm wondering if each of them do something different, and I'm sure we're going to figure that out during this series, but he gets his billy clubs and he starts practicing again, embracing Daredevil once again. So although they were pushed aside for a while and they definitely struggled to hold them back, both Daredevil and Kingpin are back, which is good because it seems like they're going to need their true selves to take on Muse, who is teased at the end of this episode. We see him take somebody back to his base underground. We see people hung up in the back, so this is clearly not his first victim, and we see him take blood from the victim, and this is because in the comics, Muse paints with blood. And at this point in time, I'm pretty sure that Muse is actually the person who was labeled as Bastion in the credits, who is the person that went to Heather Glenn during her book signing who said that he needed help. Now, this could be because this is a trick and he knows that Heather is with Matt, and perhaps he knows that Matt Murdock is Daredevil. However, this was pretty early on when Matt and Heather just got together. So perhaps he really does need help. I mean, he clearly needs help, but perhaps he is actually seeking help to try to stop a darker side of him, which is Muse. So that's Daredevil Born Again episode 4. It was definitely a slower episode, but it built to a lot that is about to happen next in the series. So go ahead, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments down below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss any of our Daredevil Born Again breakdowns and of course any of our videos on Marvel News. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.